Hey everybody, what a taste we got. And now we'll have a little more conversation. You can feel free to come a little closer if you'd like. We're getting set up. You get to see behind the scenes as well as a taste. So give yourselves a round of applause for coming out today. He does everything. He brings out the stuff, he writes the work. Pretty phenomenal. Thank you. Hi. So we have a little bit of a plan, not too complicated. We're going to center the history first and then go back to the creative group that you heard from earlier. Give them a round of applause for getting us started. And as you know, Shepsu can't get too much applause, so cannot. Does everybody have a mic? Everybody's good? All right, we need a mic for Erica and Dr. West. So we might kind of share, we might not. We'll see. I told you it's behind the scenes. So I'm Sylvia. I'm not just here because I love to come out in the cold on a Saturday. I'm a supporter of the Center for Performing Arts and a member of the advisory board. So that's one of the reasons that I'm here today. And I'm excited to talk about the role history can play in bringing us together. My panel that you haven't met, our guest is Erica Griffin. She is the Elizabeth F. Cheney Director of Education at the Chicago Historical Museum, previously with DuSable, and we're so glad to have her with us. And you're going to get more perspective from our very own Dr. Phyllis West, the Director of the Social Justice Initiative here at GSU. So I want to start out by talking about the role that history can play. But Erica, tell us a little bit about what you do at the History Museum and talk about repositories of knowledge and memory.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. How are you all doing out there? Yes, please clap it up. Clap for yourselves. Thank you for coming out. And thank you for such a great question. You know, history really provides us with a lens to understand how we've come to be in the situations that we are in currently. What were those events, those mechanisms, those systems over time that have built up and up and up and literally shaped not only our city, but the way that we experience it as different people? And the Race Riot of 1919 is one of those large events that had these lasting moments on the way that many of us engage with Chicagoland today. Everything from how we're educated to how we are policed, to where we live. And it's the role of institutions like the Chicago History Museum and my role in particular to not only care for and preserve these objects that tell us these stories, just like the wonderful images you all saw on the screen. I'm sure we'll talk about those later, but many of them are from the Chicago History Museum's collection. But what we hope to do is encourage people to think about the past through engagement with objects like images and documents, even clothing. And the ultimate goal is to get people up close and personal with those materials so that they begin to think differently as the gaps in our historical knowledge are filled, to consider public memory. What we think we know about a time period can often be shaped by those in power. And when stories are difficult or ugly or are colored with race, as many stories are in the United States, those are oftentimes pushed to the back burner or swept under the rug or omitted, which doesn't help us understand how we've come from A to B, doesn't help us think about what the future might be. So my role at the Chicago History Museum in the Education Department is to fill in those gaps through engagement with primary source materials and create experiences for all to enjoy, whether it's our young audiences that are school age, adults, teens, and everyone in between. I firmly believe that history is needed so that we understand and can contend with our present and consider what more equitable futures might look like for everyone. So that's my
Thank
role.
you. That's a good description of your role and also the institution. These conversations can be hard, but the creativity of the theater world allows us access to get to stories, solutions, and to reflect together. So we've had a sneak peek at the work. I'd love a little bit later to get a synopsis again about what the genesis of 1919 was, but I'm going to come to Dr. Phyllis West and ask about the contemporary lens that many of the folks that you work with, and I can call them young people because I'm an old lady, with no disrespect to them, but what's the contemporary lens on this kind of work, and why is it important to build those bridges to the past?
This work is vital, right? Because if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And as you so well know, we've repeated our history, right? What we've done in the past, prior to becoming the director of the Social Justice Initiative, is I was a social work professor, and a number of our social workers, alumni, are out there right now in the audience. And you can clap for yourselves. And I acknowledge them for a reason of saying why it's important. Here at GSU, it's important because they're being trained to do the work and carry that work on. It's our legacy to do things different, right? What kind of legacy do we want to leave? We want to do something different. Well, how do you know if you're really doing a difference in community with families unless you have a major impact by knowing the history and teaching the history to community, individuals, and families? There are different ways in which you can use this history. This summer, we were very fortunate. I think Dorothy is in the audience right now. We were very fortunate this summer to take 2 groups to the Gullah Sea Islands and to Charleston, South Carolina, where they could actually see one of the #1 slave ports in the United States. And then we took them to the Gullah Sea Islands, where they were able to witness not only tragedy or sadness, but they saw places and spaces where people were able to thrive, who were former slaves, were able to thrive in community when left alone with all of their skills. And today, their heritage still sits there today. When we took a group of employees there who did gang violence work, it was their moment in time to say, okay, this is our why. We know now that we can go back to our home, Chicago, we can go back to Inglewood, we can go back to North Lawndale, and we can make a difference. Because we can now see what our ancestors had to go through, and now we know what we've been called to do. Sylvia, I want to also say that that history is important for our ancestors, right? For each of us to learn about our ancestry and to understand and to see what is it that you've been called to do, not to just leave this as a philosophical conversation, but what action can we take knowing what has already been done to try to change this world? What are we going to do next?
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you've got such great colleagues in the audience, and we'll hear from them a little bit later because we will take your questions. But I'd like to center again that historic moment. We've got the playwright and the artistic director of Impact Theater, Shepsu Ayaku. We've got Andy White, Red Summer playwright, Looking Glass Theater ensemble member, and Sean White. Everybody loves Sean White. Sean Wallace. Everybody really loves Sean Wallace, okay? We've got Sean Wallace, as I'm looking at Andy White, who is the composer and just an outstanding arranger with so many artists in Chicago. But Shepsu, let's talk about the historic moment, if you don't mind, and give us the summary, and Andy can jump in as well, that led to the Red Summer.
Just to clarify, the the historical moment, not the moment that we decided to write the play, correct?
Let's do the historical moment first.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So the fun of it, and by fun I mean that as a person who loves stories, it's just an incredibly ripe period of time to be alive in America. So one of the things that I have a hard time communicating to people is the state of disruption and the feeling that the world could be coming to an end as I know it. And so not to betray my age too much, one of the things that I often talk about with the 60s is everybody looks at the 60s through the eyes of the present. And we kind of know how it turned out. And so we don't live in the moment by moment of the 60s where it felt like at any moment the America that we knew and the American experiment was going to absolutely collapse. And what was life going to be like after that? The thing that's important about that for all of you is if you weren't here for the 60s, you went through that exact same cultural moment over the last 2 years. That's the moment of the play. It's when everything that you think defines your life and normalcy is disrupted, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, and uncertainty sits at the core of it. So to get real specific, the Great War is just coming to an end. I will create some context for that. So there's one act of violence in the Balkans, and then all of Europe basically chooses sides, and then everything goes to hell real fast. That's very similar to the world that we have now. The Spanish flu, inappropriately named because it came from America. It's a whole nother story. Seems very similar, doesn't it? The Spanish flu and that pandemic swept the world and killed millions of people. And you had essentially no protection, no vaccination, and no one was really sure how you got it or how to stay well. Very similar to the world that we live in now. The anarchist movement, which is the thing that no one ever talks about, is bombing things all over the country all of the time. And so the belief in government as a solution is not a widespread held belief. And we haven't even gotten to the specifics of Black reality, which is we've come out of, we're a generation and a half out of the Reconstruction period, which is when we thought things were going to change, and now it's become real clear it's not. For a great number of Black families, particularly when we think about Chicago, we talk about the Great Migration and how it works. It basically follows the railroad lines. So they came straight north because the railroad lines came straight north, and they ended up here, St. Louis, in Detroit. There was a lot of boostering going on, for lack of a better word, about how much better lives were here. And so people that were still indentured to the land in the South picked up everything, frequently without telling anybody, because there was all kinds of problems, for letting people know that you planned on leaving this place where they shackled you to the land, and you came to a city that was wholly unprepared for your arrival. And then that city has a set of politics that you really don't understand. Southern aggression looks very different than Northern aggression. They're both really aggressive. They look very different. And in that world, Black people tried to figure out how to create communities, build their families, and take care of themselves. And that's the world that we started off with the play. And I think I've covered all of the stuff you
I think you have, and we would add to that Black soldiers who had a taste of what it was like to be away and to come back to the highly, structured racism of America is I think, another underlying part. Let's talk about the actual incident, and then we'll keep going. And I think you know a bit about it, but I know you know. No, okay. So
Whoever wants, I'm fine to take it, but we can tag team
have a
whatever you
whole
want to
play
do.
talk.
you have a whole play to talk about it. So let's have our guest, Erica Griffin, tell us that pivotal moment of, the beginning, middle, end of what happened at the beach.
Absolutely, I can. And, when we spoke about mirror images over time, we literally did 2 years ago. We're still living in that moment that is directly tied. It's almost step for step the idea of being at the confluent impacts of illness, of a plague across the world, of racialized violence, of a response of a city that is unprepared to engage with people that are different. All of that was happening in 1919, and here we are again at the same moment, unfortunately. So on July the 27th, 1919, the day was unseasonably warm, in the upper 90s, and, you know, the beach, the lakefront, was that place where people could go to get reprieve. You would also see people sometimes sleeping out in the parks, Washington Park, all up and down the city. But that day, in the afternoon, people were flooded at the beach, you know, taking in the beautiful scenery and the amazing water. One thing to note, there were no harsh lines that indicated where black people could live, where white people could live, but there were invisible lines that undoubtedly gave people their boundaries that they existed under. And that meant places where you lived, places where you might fellowship for church, where you went to school, and even the part of the lake you could access. So at the time, the 29th Street Beach was indicated as the white beach, immigrant, and the 27th Street Beach, so it was reversed at the time, was the area designated for African American people. 17-year-old Eugene Williams was with a group of his friends. They had created a makeshift sort of raft that they stored away behind the outflow of a factory along the 27th Street Beach. So they dragged the raft into the water. They were having a wonderful time. And as they crept closer to that invisible line between black and white beachgoers, rocks came from the white beachgoers that were lobbied against and leveraged against these young men. And it was a game for them at first. They would duck down and hide from the rocks and pop back up and, you know, wave their hands in the air and stick out their tongues at their aggressors. It was a game, you know, until unfortunately one of those rocks came very close to Eugene. More rocks followed, and he lost his grip on the raft and sank beneath the water that day. His friends did the best that they could to go down, try to pull him up, but they could not. They went to the shore and told the officer, the first that they could find, who was African American, you know, we need help, we have to get Eugene out of the water. And the officer was asking, what happened? They said, that man right there was throwing the rocks. They're pointing at 24-year-old George, his last name is escaping me, but I'm sure it'll come back to me. He's the one who threw the rocks, him right there. Incidentally, George would not be charged with any crime, although he was eventually arrested. When Eugene was eventually recovered out of the water, of course, he had passed away. By this point, the beach was swelling with people, both black and white, and officers were trying to get people to go back to their respective sides, and someone fired a shot into the crowd. The person that fired the shot was African American. Yes, he was aiming above the officers and people that were gathered at the beach out of anger. In retaliation, he was cut down that day as well. And from there, the violence spilled off of the beach into the neighborhoods. And at that time, is everyone familiar with the term athletic club? Do we know what that means? So it was a sort of a social, political kind of...
The first Mayor Daley belonged to one.
You took the words out of my mouth. You're absolutely right. So these athletic clubs, mostly white, male associated, came into the Bronzeville neighborhood and wreaked havoc for days on end, burning homes, looting homes, inflicting violence that would lead to the injury of hundreds of people, both black and white. There were 37 people that were left dead after 8 days of this violence, so much violence that it eventually spilled into downtown. And that is when the city decided to act, and they declared martial law. In came the National Guard, and what really stopped the violence at that time was rain. The rain came down, extinguished the fires, but that vitriol, that race hatred, didn't stop at that time, and it is a moment that is a blight on Chicago's history, but it's one that we have to remember. So from that day on July the 27th, the violence that ensued carried on for that entire week, but the wounds we still deal with today. I hope I covered it.
Well, I think that's a great background of a very tragic event. Just by applause, how many people in the audience were aware of Red Summer and 1919. We've heard more about Tulsa, but applause? Okay. And how many people didn't know? Okay. And there's a lot more talk about what happened with baseball. So I'm going to come to you, Andy White. What did it mean for you to be a part of this conversation, and why is it important even after the anniversary for this story to continue?
Taking the last part first, for all the reasons that have already been alluded to, because the story does continue, because it's not like our past is safely behind us. It's very much something that I think we're all living through and in every day, and can erupt again. It's always simmering, and sometimes it tends to sort of boil over into more visible presence and more visible physical violence, but it's always there until, I think as Phyllis was suggesting, until we really address it more in a more forthcoming way. So I think that helps me answer the first part of your question, which is why, or what did it mean to me? First of all, we've been friends for a long time and colleagues for, nigh on 30 years. And so the opportunity to partner on a project like this was personally meaningful, to be able to work with a friend, but to be able to work with a friend on this content, which has always been something that I've been, have thought about and has sort of woven its way in and out of my life in different ways. So, as Shepsu was alluding to also, that the way the current moment eerily parallels, which we could not have foreseen when we started work on this back in 2016. We knew there were going to be some resonances, because they always are, they're always there, but to have this particular combination of things is both eerie and problematic. But look, it's, I think as artists, that's for us an opportunity to try and bring to the surface the conversations, and then to bring Sean into the mix as well, who takes our words and actually turns them into magical beauty, along with an awesome cast. Then it's like this beautiful alchemy.
Well, and thank you, Andy, because I had a question for Sean. And Sean, you've done so much work around the city on a variety of projects with figures known and unknown and historic as well, Maggie Brown, others. What surprised you about this story, and what resonated with you the most?
Timelessness. We started working on this in 2019, and that's the first thing that struck me, is that it's deja vu all over again. And it struck me that way even before we went through deja vu all over again. With the pandemic and George Floyd and all the other deaths, and it's one thing to you study, or you say music composition, or you live in kind of an Afrofuturist space, right? But it's another thing that, like I said, to really walk that walk, which the past, the present, the future is all now. And so that's this. I won't call it eerie. It's like a nexus. We're at another nexus, because we've come back around in this spiral. It's not a straight line, at least from a lot of indigenous people don't see time as a straight line. You see a lot of spirals whenever we see the artwork, the language of many peoples around the world. And so we're at a spiral point where we know we're not exactly where we were. The conditions aren't exactly the same. But are we going to take advantage of the tools that we have now to make some different choices? And that's the thing that has been so much fun in terms of working on the piece.
And I think that'll be something I'd like to end with, along with sharing some resources. We'll come back to that a little bit later about the choices we can make, even as we see a possible black woman Supreme Court justice and the questions that she's asked about critical race theory. Shepsue, you talked about the convergence, but I want to go back to you're talking about the other times in history when it seems like there'd be change. You know, the Reconstruction. In some of my work with Dr. Henry Louis Gates and PBS, that at one point seemed like a hopeful time, and what a robbery of promise that the actual execution of Reconstruction turned out to be. You mentioned the 60s. When you're thinking about this artwork and you see the tragedy of promises that haven't been kept, how do you keep going to continue to inspire, and whether it's in an Afrofuturist way or with Farrell and some of your other work, how do you continue to keep that optimistic hope that the world can go on and we can make right choices?
It's funny. First, thank you for the question. Forgive me for fighting these allergies because they're
Climate
serious
change.
right now. Woo. My reputation isn't necessarily for writing the most hopeful things, which is actually kind of funny. But I do find them to be so. They're just true. And so the question is, how do I show black people in a world that is true to the black people I know, right? So one of the things that I say to Andy all the time, first of all, I work with a dream team of people. I've known Sean, we actually started Impact together in college. So that's the guy who taught me everything I knew about music. I've known Andy for just as long and taught me everything about working in arts ed together. And so when it was time to put together the group of people, it was just the dream team of who do you want to go to work with every day where you're going to have an awesome time. Part of the fun of that is I told Andy as the script was coming together how much fun it was to hear his voice in the play, because I could not write, there's a family called the Weirs, I can't write those people that way because that's a different experience for me. So that's the Irish family in the story. In terms of the hopefulness for black people, what I really concentrate on, that's not even a fair statement. What I'm conscious of, whether I'm thinking about it directly at the moment or not, is as an African American, my people are the survivors and the thrivers of the American experiment. Right? And that means that you are always grounded in the crap you had to go through, and how if all you did was pay attention to the crap, there would be no reason to go through it. So me and my mother have this conversation, because my mother is a very practical woman from the Delta in Mississippi, and she says, you know, you got to remember that your people are the ones that chose to not throw themselves over the side of the boat. Those people, their line ended there. This line is the people that said, I do not know what is coming, but I'm about to get to that. And when you write these people, you have to understand that they frequently do not know what is coming, but they are certain that they're going to have to meet that thing. And in doing so, frequently figure out wonderful ways to do it. So I'm not always caught up in the trauma of being black as it is used in America. Forgive this diatribe, but I'm going to go there real quick. So there's a whole thing happening in Hollywood now where black trauma is now television. So there's a show I tried to watch called Them, which was on one of those streaming services, and it was about gentrifying Compton. And about 3 episodes in, it just occurred to me that all I was doing was watching black people suffer for 60 damn minutes. And I didn't need that in my life. I had enough suffering around me that I could have held with 30 minutes of suffering and then some other stuff. That's the Martha family word. But right? But we didn't get that. So how do you keep it and move forward? To get back to the question is, you just stay true to the people you know. You stay true to the life you have, and that shows up on stage. And so it's not thinking through, I'm going to make positive choices. It's saying, I don't know those black people, so I'm not writing that. I know those black people. Their lives will be alive in the thing that I do, and that's it.
Well, and August Wilson did it, and we've got you, so we can continue.
Oh, that's nice.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to come to Dr. West, and I want to ask you both about what surprised you, and also what can the folks that you work with and the vision that Dr. Green and that you have for the Institute here, what can be informed by this? Starting with surprise.
There's a quote, and there's a documentary that's been out for a while called A Forgotten Injustice. And it tells the story of us illegally deporting thousands and thousands of Latinx people to Mexico even when they didn't speak Spanish. And that also happened around 1929, 1930, during the Great Depression. I said that so far in order to say my response. One of the elders, historians in the documentary said that when you're a historian, you're never really happy because you know too goddamn much.
Hey, did you all hear that?
I'm not surprised. There was nothing that surprised me. I think the part that saddens me is I was a history major in undergrad, never learned it. And although we're talking about 1919 in Chicago, the reality is of the dozens and dozens of massacres and race riots that happened during that time throughout the nation. And that's another story that we don't tell. So I'm thanking you for the richness of telling us these stories. We don't want to be traumatized again. And I just told him the month of February feels like that to me very often. I have to turn off my TV. It's what we do with it, though, what we do with the history, it becomes traumatic when we do nothing with it but sit with it and digest it and use it as a recording. However, just like when we take students to the dungeons, and we don't call them slave castles, we call them dungeons, in Ghana or Senegal, whenever you embark upon a dungeon and you feel and you see the blood of our ancestors on the floor, there's a lot of screaming and pain that we're doing because we could feel that spirit and that very energy in that room, in the dungeon. And we can sit with that and be angry and do more riots, or we can use it like vibranium and have a spirit of determination to know that we're going to do, we can. You don't have a choice. If it could destroy you, it would have, but it didn't. So the Social Justice Center is a center for determination and dedication to the will and the public will, that there's so many of us who really deeply want to do well and who want to make this world a better place. We're creating a space for that. It will be a part of research, it'll be a part of practice, service, but it's us uplifting each other, and that's a collective. That's not just one race. That's all of us, those of us who are serious about it. I heard once that it's not the people who are doing bad who we should be mad at. It's the people who say we're doing good, yet we don't say anything when we should.
Well, thank you, and that is true words. There's a book called Healing, An Invitation to Heal America's Racial Karma by Dr. Larry Ward, if anyone ever gets a chance to take a look at that looks at the long history of devaluing certain lives, but Black lives, but also the building of the country, and how it really will take all of us, wherever our ancestors came from, to really heal. And to heal, you have to see what really happened. And that's what a play like this helps us to do. So get your questions ready. There's a couple of mics, so be that first person to ask a good question. And while you're thinking about that, I just want to come to Erica and ask a little bit about some of the resources. I saw that picture of the Defender. I'm not sure where that came from. I don't know if you could see on the headline, it was like, stay home and, don't talk foolishness. There are some interesting things that only foolish talk is no good now. Stop it. That's something you can only get from the Black press, which I love, Soldiers Without Swords. But what are some of the other resources that will be available or are available for people who want to dig more deeply into this?
That is an excellent question. And before I answer, Dr. West, thank you for sharing. That was a word, I must say, and help support the bits that I'm going to tell you about resources. So the Chicago History Museum has over 30,000 objects that speak to our stories, histories, narratives, people, and beyond. And particularly focusing on the race riot, we have a large collection of images that are striking, that are poignant, but we have to make available so that all can learn. So out of the Race Riot selection of materials, some of which you saw on the screen, many of those images, I must say, come from a particular photographer named Jun Fujita, who was a Japanese immigrant to Chicagoland. And it's interesting that he was able to get in and take those up close and personal photographs because he wasn't Black, he wasn't white, he wasn't a soldier. At that time, he was almost invisible, and was able to get the images that give us the insight and understanding of what happened on those days. So what we've done is created a series of resources for educators for 6th through 8th grade and then 9th through 12th grade classrooms. These take some of the images and encourage young people to understand how they might relate to their own lives, provides additional sources that share more detail into the story. For instance, The Negro in Chicago, which was a study that was developed out of the University of Chicago by a collective of 12 civic and social and leaders and thinkers at the time. And it includes, interestingly enough, a set of 57 recommendations for law enforcement, for educators, for the media and the press, that encouraged more togetherness, more understanding and awareness of other types of people to try to break some of those lines that exist between Black and white at the time. And all of those 57, of course, went unheeded, which also leads to the way that our city and Chicagoland operate today. But in addition to the resources for educators, we also have teen programs that encourage them to also use the museum's collection. And we just had, in 2019, a program that brought together a group of African American teens from the Bronzeville neighborhood and shared this story of the race riot with them. Like many of the people on the panel have been saying, they'd had no understanding of what happened in 1919, wasn't included in any of their lessons, wasn't included in the school system, and they're living in the neighborhood where this instance happened. So we gathered them together, walked them through the materials, took them on tours of where these important sites were in their neighborhood, and they created an amazing comic book that positioned them as time travelers. They went back to the time of the riot, changed the narrative, changed the city that existed today and made it look like something that they wanted to see. And there's been a lot of conversation here about action. What do you do once you have this history? I will say this, you all have chosen today an action to educate yourselves about this narrative, and for that we are all grateful here. And that's the role of museums. That's the purpose of these resources, again, is to get people to take action, digest the history, and do something. I must also make mention the DuSable Museum still has an exhibition up called Troubled Waters, the Race Riot of 1919, that explores the story in more detail and makes it clear that, yes, Chicago was the host to the largest instance of racialized violence in 1919, but there were 24 other instances of racialized violence all across the country, north and south, in 1919. And I must stress again, we are dealing with the same issues bubbling up again and again and again. And at some point, the more we put this information out there, we encourage you all to pick up and think about action. So I keep the good fight going.
Well, thank you. And again, if you've got a question, I think there's a mic here, there's a mic there. You can raise your hand so I know that you're out there. Thanks. There's a little light so you can see it. But is this a question over here? Or that's a camera person. All right, thank you. I want to come to Sean before we see if there are questioners. That might be Lana. Come with your question, and I'm going to ask Sean a question really quick. The Black and Tan music scene was pretty amazing. How did that work come about, and did you all collaborate on what was being said? Because in the middle of that dancing, there was some real stories being told. So what was the creative choice behind that? I'll start with you, and you can pass it on as needed.
Well, we're all storytellers. Whether we do music, we do dance, you do visual art, you do stories as a writer, as an actor, we're all telling stories. I mean, at some point, it starts at that campfire many eons ago. And so the whole creative team, we're all looking for the story in whatever it is. And that's been a really cool part about working with these gentlemen, because a lot of times I'm pushing in the story, like, well, wait a minute, this character I need more hope in this, and so it's not, because a lot of times people think, well, writers write and composers compose, and they hear these words, write to it. And it's like, no, we're trying to craft the best stories that we can. And so our choreographer, Ruben Eccles, was asking the dancers in rehearsal the whole week, so what's the story? Tell me that, let me see it, make a decision. How does that influence your move? How does that influence how you're interacting with each other? Being from Chicago, and again, this is a timeless, in my opinion, piece. The whole piece, you heard a little bit in the Black and Tan, you heard a little bit of house music.
There you go.
Because that was then and it is now, and I grew up on it, and so why wouldn't there have been something to dance to? And when one part kind of came out, I'm thinking, well, you could do the Charlestons of this if you wanted to, but it's going to most people's ears, it might sound like house music. Well, because it is. But again, to just play with these eras and genres, and then and I was also thinking in my mind, what would a choreographer want to play with?
Yeah, and Ruben is an outstanding choreographer with a great pedigree. Is this a question down here? Come on up to the mic, and thank you so much. If you feel free to take it out, whatever you need to do. No, it's very bright. That's okay.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for doing this. I'm so grateful that you're presenting such a complex, complicated story, right? That resonates, as you all have said today. So thank you for this. My question is, first, a quick comment on Black and Tan. A few people have alluded to the importance of language, right? And it's just so striking for me. Of course, the meaning of words changes over time and for different peoples. And so it struck me that Black and Tans as the name of those places where people could actually, of different races, the only places it seems where they did intermingle in many ways. What that meaning might have meant too for some of those Irish Americans who committed so much of that racist violence in 1919, because black and tans to the Irish refers to the British soldiers who oppressed them, right? So one of the weird contradictions. But my question for you is, this story is so complex, and already with just the tastes that you've given us, you've reflected that complexity. I'm also talking about the segregated housing, the Great Migration, the end of the war, the soldiers' disappointment. They fought for democracy in Europe, and then they don't have it at home. I'm wondering if you're also include in it some of the labor conflicts, and particularly the tensions in the stockyards in between among the unions, right, and different people, both women, immigrants, women, African Americans being used as strike breakers, and how that adds another whole layer of complexity and shows also interclass conflict in addition to the racial conflict.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question, because there was a little bit of an allusion to socialism, I thought I heard. But anyone want to take that up? Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate the question and the feedback. So it's really difficult to figure out, of all of the things that are happening, what are you going to drill down on? And it's even more of an issue in a musical, because the musical numbers are just going to take up a certain amount of real estate. And so you always have to make a choice between, do I want an inch deep and a mile wide, or do I want an inch wide and a mile deep? And we wanted to drill down deep on what this specific racial conflict is in Chicago, give it as much context as we could, and recognize that in the time we had, we were never going to cover all of the social issues. So I'm going to give you guys a different sort of way to process it, well, different to me anyway. We can't ask the one piece of art to be everything that we need it to be. We need to start thinking about, and this is one of the things that always happens to us as black people, is we get so few opportunities to tell our stories that we then demand that those stories cover so much. We do speak of the labor disputes. There is a ongoing confrontation at the stockyards in the show, but none of that stuff, to be fair, gets unpacked to the point where you think the story's really about the stockyards. We do spend a fair amount of time covering what it means to be these women working in these places and what their lives mean. The fun of today is you met none of the central characters. So we were very intentional not to give you who the central characters were to the stories, because they are two working class families. And I will give away this much: the work that they do is the exact same work. So the black family and the white family are doing the same work, and let's just say it is some back-breaking work. But we had to make a choice about what do we do here. When we were having the resource question, it occurred to me that sometimes we research and we forget, because we're so specific and we're used to researching keywords, that it isn't even the subject that gives you the greatest insight. It's understanding the context and the period. So I'll give you a couple of things that were very useful to me and also address the question. Jack Johnson was fascinating to me. He was a heavyweight champion. He also owned a Black and Tan in Chicago. It's referenced in the story, but in watching everything about him, what I began to understand is what it meant to come of age as a black person in that period. And as a person, him being the heavyweight champion of the world, who was at the height of his powers, what were his limitations? And then that just triggers the next set of resources and the next set of resources. And so sometimes it isn't about searching for riots. It's figuring out what's going on. There's a lovely book around World War I and black soldiers. The most interesting things I learned about World War I had nothing to do with Chicago. They had everything to do with how black soldiers were actually deployed in the quote-unquote European theater. That information also colors our characters. And so I want to encourage you to broaden what you're studying, because the whole period is alive, just like it is for you today. And if you studied everything you saw today, you couldn't watch a TV show and say, well, you can. I want more of that. But the answer is, it's probably not that show. That's another show. And our job as creatives are to say, yeah, we're going to get another show. And we get a chance to build that world out and have those conversations as well. I hope that paid respect to the question that was offered.
I love that. And it's also a sense of equity also, in that we deserve more time and more space and more platforms to get to the complexity and to tell all the stories. I think this will be our last question from the audience, and then I'm going to come to each of you. Please. Good afternoon.
I just want to say two things. One, the History Museum, the Chicago History Museum, is such a great resource. I've been up there many times, both doing research for myself, but also just to reconnect. And my only complaint is its location. But it's a wonderful resource, and I think everybody should take the opportunity to go there and just spend a day reveling in that history, particularly if you're from Chicago, which I am. I actually grew up in Inglewood when Inglewood was Inglewood in terms of resources and whatnot. The other thing I want to say is that and I have this conversation all the time, it's critically important that this history be brought to our young people. I'm convinced that much of what we're seeing today in terms of violence and whatnot, it would not be going on, much of it would not be going on if our young people knew their history and how connected and what they're connected to. And many of our young people just don't know that, don't know anything. And even in terms of family reunions, I think family reunions should be done more, should have more meaning than just people reconnecting with each other. At the very least, I've suggested in my own family, let's develop a directory so that people across the country in the same family at least know what everybody does. So if you need a carpenter, let's say, you might be able to find it within your own family and begin to redirect those resources within your own family. But anyway, going back to my main point, let's get this history to our young people because they really, really, really need it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Connection to our history, connection to our richness, connection to the elders who can help us see around corners that we may not yet know exists, and also connecting our elders to visions for the present and the future. There's so much that we can do together, and I'm going to ask each of you briefly to just say what you'd like people to take away from this experience today and from the play itself. And we know that educating ourselves is at a minimum, right? The thing that we can do. And I applaud those who've come out from everywhere to the Southland to make that happen. I applaud you to come to the Southland and bring the History Museum. Partnering with other institutions is a key goal because this is a rich part of our region, and everything doesn't happen, on the north side. So all of that is a good thing that we've got here together. And yes, you can applaud that if you're a Southlander. But I'm going to just, go right down the line. I will do playwrights last, but I'm going to ask Sean, Dr. West, and Erica, what do you want people to take away from this? And I'll come with you, Sean.
Living history is right now. We are reliving the same history because we didn't integrate the lessons of the so-called past. So if we don't want to do this again in 50, 100, 500 years, we need to integrate, not just learn, integrate the lessons that we're presenting so that we can heal from these lessons. That's really what I mean by integrate. And that we're all in this together. It's not just one group of people's work. It's not just one sect. It's not just, the men got to do it, the women got to do it. We are all in this together.
Thank you, and that was perfect length. Dr. West?
When we think about that moment in time of what happened on the beach that day, as I prepared for this, I kept thinking about what happened and what is the takeaway. So I'm going to give you a part of that takeaway for me and just for us to think about it collectively. There were a group of people and they threw rocks and a young man drowned. That was in a community. That was with peers. People were with their friends. And it was in a public space. I would want for us to take away from this, what do we do in our private spaces with our friends, our peers, in public spaces, and within our family, our different family members? How do we show up with courageous conversations that could actually prevent something like this from happening if we're witnessing it? So it's not a big ask. It's just one that I think we take for granted. Usually we forget the little things that count. And it's the everyday heroes and sheroes out there just going to work or going to church that could make a difference. So I'm asking us to go into our churches, go into our homes, talk to our family members, talk to ourselves, and ask ourselves deeply and self-evaluate who we are and how are we showing up with this information. What is spoken to you today that you need to take away, and what action do you need to take based on what you heard today for yourselves?
Thank you. Beautiful.
I can say this as a historian and a museum professional. I love talking about history. I love connecting people to moments just like 1919. But sometimes when we review history, as something that is in the past, it loses a lot of that significance. We see this overarching moment. We can sort of put it into a box and it becomes inanimate. But history is with us all the time. I also want everyone to remember that, this story did impact our entire city. Bronzeville was leveled to the ground. The neighboring Lithuanian neighborhood was also burnt to the ground, but in the center there was a boy, and his name was Eugene. He had a family, he had hopes, he had dreams, he had friends, and sometimes when we have these larger-than-life moments, we forget about the impetus, and in this case, people have forgotten Eugene. So I encourage us all to remember with this particular story that there was a boy, he was alive, he was a real person, and we don't want to forget him in this mix. And again, for myself, the History Museum is far from here, it is, but I encourage you all to visit. That is also an action. That's activating our civic responsibility to learn, consider, and then what can you do once you have that history? So my takeaway is, let's not remember the small parts, those parts of history that get overlooked. And in this case in particular, please do remember Eugene.
Thank you. Andy White?
At Looking Glass, I am the Director of Community Engagement in the Department of Curiosity. And so I think, so I guess that's something that I'm continually trying to cultivate in myself and encourage in others, is curiosity, which, I don't need to define, we all know what that is, but it is, I think, primarily thought of as an intellectual pursuit, like, you're curious with your brain. And its twin sister, I think, is empathy, which I think of as curiosity of the heart. It's the same impulse, which is to better understand our fellow humans, whether we do that with our heads or with our hearts. So that's the thing that I would hope we would take away. The one last thing that I want to add is my gratitude to you, Sylvia, and Svetlana, and the tech team and the cast, and our guests, Sylvia, Erica, and Phyllis, for sharing with us all your good counsel, your wisdom, your acquired experience, which has been great.
Oh, thank you. Andy's talking about the fact that we've had a lot of conversation about beyond conversation, and it's really seeing the center walk the walk of what came out of the George Floyd pandemic and everything else, really being committed to continue to give people different experiences. And Chef Sue.
I am a crier. And I have to contextualize that. If there's a commercial on for anything, I cry. My family finds this to be funny, but I actually think it's a symptom of a problem, which is that as a black male, I'm really not permitted to connect to my own emotions. And they will find a way out, and it's baby pamper commercials. And that's just sad and pathetic to me. I say that to say this. We are stunted emotionally because we keep coiling up like a pill bug because the shit just keeps coming at us. And we shut down. And when we do that, part of our soul atrophies. The joy of being an artist is to put you in a room and say, it's okay to feel. And that feeling can motivate a multitude of things. But if I don't give you the space to breathe, see yourself, your journey, and validate it for both its joy and its pain. All the stories don't end pretty, but they still are stories. And we shut down because it just keeps coming at us. So if I talk about what do I want the takeaway to be, it's not a specific lesson. It's about re-gifting the joy of feeling. Most of you probably had a mama like mine who said something like, you get 3 days to sit on that couch and feel bad for yourself, and then I'm gonna need you to get up because we got stuff to do. And I think that there's something very powerful in that, but it also, as an artist, I am reminded that part of that tells you, shut that off. That's not helping you. We got the stuff to do. And I try to reconnect it the other way. Don't shut it off. Learn how to channel it, learn how to process it, learn how to integrate it, learn how to allow it to fuel your curiosity about more things, learn how to connect with the people around you, learn how to invest in the resources, not just of your community, but if you can get to it, it's yours. That's the thing that you want from a simple little show. I ask a lot, and I cry at commercials.
Well, thank you. We thank you for coming. We thank our panelists. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that my daughter wrote a book called 1919 based on the report that was done. Her name is E-Viewing, Dr. E-Viewing, so you can look that up. And my son is involved with the Harold Washington 100th anniversary. His birthday is coming up and is reading books like Fire on the Prairie and getting fired up with all these things that were part of history. And I just say that to echo what Dr. West said. What are we teaching at home? What are we learning from the next generation? They are saying it's okay for you to cry. And they are saying it's okay for you to be tired. And it's okay for you to want to be more than resilient and to want a seat at your own table. So together, in spaces like this, we can continue the conversation and, more importantly, take it out into the world. So I'm going to pass it on to Lana, and thank you for your patience. It was good to be here.